It's Warren Barfield on Vision Christian Radio. It's Neil with you, the Friday edition of 2020. And yes, a controversial conversation coming over this next hour. One you might like to join into. And you might have your own thoughts, your own prayer focus on how these things work so far as Australia goes. We're going to be talking with a focus on the disappearing Christians of the Middle East. But with all the controversy over ISIS brides being brought home to Australia, our thoughts might turn to what has happened to Christian communities ravaged by ISIS in the Middle East. Most Christians in nations like Syria and Iraq were under such brutal persecution that they were driven from their homelands and their churches destroyed. Their very existence was under threat, and church leaders feared their extinction. Well, right now, the number of Christians living in Syria has reportedly declined from somewhere around 1.5 million before 2011 to roughly just 300,000 today. And in Iraq, the Assyrian population declined from 1.4 million to as few as just 100,000 today. Well, our conversation is around the disappearing Christians of the Middle East. And our special guest, Elizabeth Kendal, is a religious liberty analyst and advocate for the persecuted church. Elizabeth is a former principal researcher for the World Evangelical Alliance Religious Liberty Commission. She's also an adjunct research fellow at the Arthur Jeffries Centre for the Study of Islam at the Melbourne School of Theology. Elizabeth Kendal, a special welcome back to 2020.
And thank you for having me, Neil.
Well, Elizabeth, there's so many different spin-off type of topics that we could talk about, and perhaps we will. We've just been talking with Bill Muhlenberg around some issues around Dan Andrews and his acknowledgement of the Prophet Muhammad and certain favour towards the Islamic community in Victoria. But let's get a focus really towards the Middle East on this big issue that we have spoken about now, I think, numerous times over the years. The crisis of Christians being displaced out of Middle Eastern nations, not recovering post-ISIS and not returning to their homeland, not returning to their homes and to their churches. This is something that you've been monitoring.
Yes, it's an absolute crisis, and it's not talked about at all. I am often just astounded when I hear news from the Middle East. It doesn't even include the Christian population, as if they don't exist. And it's almost as if they're an embarrassment. They're an inconvenient embarrassment that the West doesn't want to talk about because it would expose the West's powerlessness, its policy failures, and the fact that the legacy of much Western meddling will actually be the genocide of the Christian population in the Middle East, the place where Christianity emerged and from where it spread. So it's a crisis. It's real. We're looking at genocide probably in our lifetime, and it's an absolute tragedy and a disgrace how much silence is around it.
I know we've had previous conversations about the Assyrian people and genocide, and this has been one of the passions that you've had now for many years. And the Assyrian community traces its roots with their Christianity back to, I guess, 1st century. How do you describe?
That's right.
How do you describe the homeland that we're talking about for Christians, and what has happened with this displacement?
Well, Christians who know their Bibles will know that the Assyrians appear in the Old Testament. The Assyrian Empire under their great kings and Sennacherib in particular brought the Assyrian army into Israel and then into Judah at the time of Isaiah. So you can read about the Assyrians in Isaiah. You can read about them in the book of Kings, where it talks about the Assyrian invasion of Israel and then Judah. They were the superpower of the day, of Isaiah's day. So we're looking at about 700 BC and 735 BC. They were a huge empire going right around the Fertile Crescent. They were fearsome. They would invade lands, they would take captives, they would repopulate the land with foreigners, and they were a big power. Now, we also know from our Old Testament that God sent the prophet Jonah to Assyria, to its capital, which was Nineveh. And Jonah didn't want to go because, these were the horrible, horrible Assyrians. They were the enemy, and he didn't want to go. But God sent him there anyway. He preached, repent, because the kingdom of God is at hand, and they did. And the Assyrian people became followers of Yahweh. And Jonah's tomb is still there in Nineveh, in the Nineveh plains of northern Iraq. We don't know if Jonah's actually buried there, but it's there and it's guarded. Now, that was when the Assyrians started to have diplomatic relations with Israel, with Judah. And they followed the scandal of Jesus of Nazareth. They heard all about it, and they believed. And they became followers of Jesus, yes, in the very first century of the Christian era. So they have been Christians for a long, long time.
Would we say that those nations, or the land that the Assyrians occupied, Syria and Iraq, would we have called those in earlier generations Christian nations?
Well, certainly the Assyrians are a Christian nation, and they were spread across much of Iraq and much of northern Syria and into southern Turkey. Probably for a long, long time in our lifetime anyway, there have been Muslim nations, and the Assyrians and have become like the remnant of a remnant. They have faced numerous massacres, and some of them are, in my mind, especially tragic. So probably the biggest threat to their existence came back in the 14th century when Tamerlane, the Mongol Empire, came through from the steppes, and Tamerlane basically annihilated Christianity all across Central Asia and into Iraq, and that was devastating. But probably the one that really hurts me personally the most is knowing that during World War I, the Assyrian people, the Assyrian nation, supported the Allies in its war against the Ottoman Empire. And they were told by the British, by the Allies, that in exchange for their support, they would, when the land was all carved up at the end of the war, they would receive a nation. The Assyrian nation would be born. And of course, it didn't happen. The British left the region in the 1930s, and they left the Assyrians sitting there in the middle of Arabs, Kurds, and Turks that had already, affected a massive genocide already in the Armenian genocide, and they were just slaughtered. They were slaughtered. So we are looking at a very small remnant that is just struggling to survive in their homeland, in the land where they are the indigenous people. They have been betrayed and abandoned by the West. They're co-religionists, and it's just, I don't think God doesn't see this,
I mentioned in the introduction that the numbers of the Assyrian population, the decline from 1.4 million to as few as 100,000 today. When they were displaced, though, religious sites, churches, these have been destroyed as well. And it's as though, as you say, when there's genocide or when there's a displaced people, they're trying to erase any sort of sign of Christianity. Is that the way you might look at it?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think we've all seen the images that were brought. ISIS was very proud of its destruction of Christian sites and even Assyrian sites. So, the really, really early pre-Christian pagan Assyrian temples and museum pieces. I think there was quite a lot made of ISIS going into the museums in Mosul Mosul is just like on the adjacent bank of the Tigris to where the capital city of Nineveh used to be in Sennacherib's day. And there are museums there that have incredible, Assyrian artworks and statues dating back, thousands of years. And they were smashed. One thing that is really interesting, though, is that in the reconstruction, as people who are rebuilding in Mosul have gone into some of the tunneling that ISIS had done, they are actually finding new archaeological sites, which is really amazing, really, really ancient, 3,000-year-old Assyrian temples are being found, in these caved-in tunnels that ISIS built. So, yeah.
All right, let's not have just a focus on the persecution of Christian believers in these nations coming from ISIS. A lot of people think ISIS is somehow rather completely diminished, but there's all sorts of threats that you've identified, including threats that come from sanctions connected to the US and from the Turkish people. What are the other big threats that are facing Christians in these Middle Eastern nations, and no doubt other nations too, around the Middle Eastern area?
Well, the Assyrians are spread over mainly northern Iraq now and Syria, all through Syria. They've been, because of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, pushed virtually all the Christians out of Baghdad. There are still Christians in Baghdad, but they're greatly reduced. The biggest threat to the Christians in Iraq, in northern Iraq, is land grabbing. So ISIS drove them out of their homeland. So if you think of where Mosul is, and the Nineveh Plains is to the east of Mosul, they were driven out, completely ethnically cleansed, out of the Nineveh Plains and pushed into Iraqi Kurdistan, and where they took refuge in Erbil. Now, as they're trying to make their way back, they're finding they're up against a lot of opposition from Kurds and from Shabak tribes. Now, the Shabak, some people say they're Kurds, some people say they're Arabs, but they're they seem to be a separate group, but they're Shiites. And so Baghdad and Tehran are both backing them, just like Iraqi Kurdistan is backing the Kurds, to grab the Assyrian lands, to steal their lands and essentially disinherit them from their historic heartland and homeland. That land grabbing, plus just systematic discrimination, marginalization, and violent persecution, is driving them out. So in 2016, which was when my book was published, the number of Assyrians in northern Iraq was estimated to be about 200,000. So now, since the war has ended, that's halved. And it's because they've been pushed out by these other factors. In Syria, in the meantime, that's where they're under threat from the Turkish invasion, and from which will release ISIS back onto the stage, but also horribly and terribly by the US sanctions, the Caesar sanctions, which are based on a lie, on a fraudulent report that was produced by Qatar, an enemy of Damascus. And these are suffocating sanctions. I describe it as an economic siege. So if you think of how a siege works, everyone inside the city will starve to death because no food can get in and out. And the idea of a siege is that you make the community such a pressure cooker that they eventually turn on their leaders and hand their leaders over or have a coup or something. Well, that's how the sanctions work. They are starving the Syrian people, Syrians who live in government-held areas, right, which is Damascus and Aleppo and the bulk of Western Syria. They are really, really suffering. And this is the safest, freest place for Christians to live. And it's just absolutely, I think it's bordering on criminal, what's happening with these sanctions.
So when church leaders warn that Christians in Iraq are on the verge of extinction, that's not an exaggeration. Our special guest,
absolutely.
Elizabeth Kendal, is our special guest. I do want to open our talkback lines. You might have your own reaction. You might even have an emotional concern as things are discussed in this context. Well, I want to open our talkback line, 1-800-316-316. Did you even realise anything like this was happening? 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Our special guest is Elizabeth Kendal, religious liberty analyst and advocate for the persecuted church, a really important dimension we're looking at today, and we're back with more in just a few moments. Our special guest is Elizabeth Kendal. Elizabeth is a religious liberty analyst and advocate for the persecuted church. You can read in depth some of the things we're talking about today when you visit Elizabeth's website, elizabethkendal.com. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You might have your own thoughts as our conversation continues to develop. Elizabeth, when we're talking Iraq and the Assyrian nations, as you've taken us beautifully back to some of the history, right back to even pre-Christ, but into first century and Christianity in this region, Christian nations you could characterize these as, talking about Iraq and Syria. There's another big threat that's coming to the Syrian nation today, and that is the possibility of a Turkish invasion. What are you monitoring here?
Well, Turkey has been wanting to invade northern Syria for quite some time. It invaded some years ago, I think it was 2016, they invaded or 2018, and seized control of Afrin, which is a city just north of Aleppo. And Aleppo is one of the main sort of cities in Syria, along with Damascus, that had a really sizable Christian population. About 10% of the population of Aleppo historically has been Christian, Assyrian, Armenian, and Greek. And when the Turks invaded and seized control of Afrin, we had that horrible. I think it was about 100 years after the Armenian genocide. We had that same image of Turkish troops ethnically cleansing a city of its Armenian people, and the Armenians having to flee west into Latakia, which is the Alawite heartland on the coast on the Mediterranean coast, and into the churches there where they were given refuge. So Turkey has long sought to capture northern Syria. It would actually like to go further than that and like to capture much of northern Iraq as well. It has even recently bombed places across northern Iraq. They already protect Idlib province. So Idlib province is Syria's most far northwest province. It's virtually under the control of Al-Qaeda militants. So there was a split, you'll remember, and ISIS broke away from Al-Qaeda. Well, Al-Qaeda has retained control of all of Idlib province. There are jihadists there everywhere. Some of them are ISIS too, and they live under the protection of Turkey. So there's almost no Christians left in Idlib province at all. And Turkey now wants to go right across the border. It's about 30 kilometres deep into Syria. It calls it a protection zone. Now, this will actually include some other really large cities like Kamishli, Christian cities that have large Christian populations, and even oil-rich areas. So it's long wanted to do this, and there was a terrorist attack in Turkey not all that long ago, a few weeks ago, and Erdogan is using that now as his excuse, even though no one has claimed responsibility for it, and the Kurds deny having done it. He's using that as his excuse, saying he wants to go in and create security for Turkey. And the risk that he will move into the northern Aleppo governorate, into that area just north of Aleppo city, is real. But even the bombing, he's been bombing northern Syria, and it's devastating.
So are we seeing with that sort of invasion the possibility of, reviving the Islamic terror threat that actually targets not just the West, but this ongoing battle between the Shias and the Sunnis within Islam? Is that the way you're seeing some of this potential for violence evolving?
Definitely. Now, the Turks are violent enough in their own right. They've been brutal to Syrians and to the Assyrians that they have come across. They use Al-Qaeda jihadists as their proxies. They flow in over the border with them. I'm concerned that they might use the Al-Qaeda jihadists who are based in Idlib. They might even use them as their proxies and have them expand out into the northern Aleppo governorate. In the east of Syria, it's highly unlikely, I believe, that Turkey will invade deep into eastern Syria, partly because this is where it gets super murky, sorry about this, but there is an American presence there. There is an American presence protecting the oil fields in eastern Syria. There are massive oil smuggling goes on there. Kurdish groups smuggle Syrian oil out. America smuggles Syrian oil out into its troops in Iraq. It's highly contentious because the Americans are there illegally. All the activities are illegal. But because there's Americans there, it means it's virtually impossible for the Syrian government, or even in this case for Turkey, to actually go into that area. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Turkey would be willing to just destabilize eastern Syria enough to let Islamic State wreak havoc on the Kurds, which would include the Assyrians as well. They've actually attacked and killed guards with their bombing. The Turks recently killed guards at the El Hol camp, the great big camp that houses thousands and thousands of IS families, and some escaped. And there's been the main reason Iran and Russia and America will not give Turkey the green light to invade a foreign country. It's just amazing that we're even talking about it, that they will not give them a green light to invade, is because of the threat of ISIS being basically let loose. The Kurds have been having to guard all these thousands and thousands of ISIS fighters. They can barely manage it. And if they have to fight the Turks, then ISIS will be on the loose. And that's a big threat for everybody.
So you have the Assyrian peoples with that Christian foundation, but also the Kurds. They've got this Christian foundation too. So in almost being like the meat in the sandwich between these sorts of issues that are religiously motivated, as I think listeners can hear you say, between the Sunnis and the Shias, somehow or other they've got to be able to defend their lives and their families in amidst the potential that there could be flashpoint at any particular stage. And as you say, Elizabeth, somehow or other, the major superpowers tend to try and hold off these sorts of invasions. This sort of conversation, it makes me think, is this what the world is like if you don't have a Christian governance, a Western foundation that's based on those sorts of values that we appreciate, that we actually live under in Western nations, even though we've got some criticisms of those today. But this is what the world looks like when it battles in religious wars, isn't it?
Yes, now the Kurds are Sunni Muslims, but there is a growing Christian movement amongst the Kurds because they're very secularized. In fact, there are a lot of Kurds who are more Marxist, which is one of the reasons why they have so many women on the front line. They're quite a secular Marxist groups amongst the Kurds. But the biggest problem that the Syrians face with the Kurds in Syria is Kurdish nationalism that seeks to almost annihilate the Christian history in Syria. So that there's a bit of a problem there, but they do work together in the fight against ISIS. And one of the problems is I think that the West has actually become the West in terms of its governments has become such a lover of money, a worshipper of money, believing that money fixes everything. Money will solve all our problems. If we can just have prosperity, we'll have human rights and freedom. And it's not true. And their ignorance of Islam, they have unleashed a lot of this. And the Christians are the victims of it.
Ignorance of Islam, and we might even pick up on that theme when we come back after Vision National News, because there's a lot of ignorance of Islam here in Australia as well, and there are a whole lot of other issues. We might touch on some of the peripheral issues, having laid a bit of a foundation about what's happening with Christians in the Middle East. I do want to invite listeners to join in our conversation, 1800 316 316. We'll have some more with Elizabeth Kendal, religious liberty analyst, after Vision National News. You could check out articles that Elizabeth has written, some things a little bit more in depth even than what we're talking about now. ElizabethKendal.com is Elizabeth's website. Back with more after news. Wonderful to have you with us on this Friday edition of 2020. If you are just joining our conversation, it's a fascinating conversation, and the foundation laid in the first part of the conversation is building to what might be very significant in understanding some of the things that are happening right here on our shores here in Australia. We've been talking about the disappearing Christians of the Middle East. With all the controversy over ISIS brides being brought home to Australia, our thoughts have turned to what's happened to the Christian communities ravaged by ISIS in the Middle East. And as you've heard, it's more than just ISIS. It's also Al-Qaeda still in existence. It's also potential threats of invasion coming from nations like Turkey for the nation of Syria. There are a lot of different dimensions that are going on. It really is a messy world out there, and a dangerous world that we live in. We're talking through some of the issues today around disappearing Christians of the Middle East, and we might be wondering about disappearing Christians wherever a Christian foundation is being lost. Our special guest today is Elizabeth Kendal, a religious liberty analyst and advocate for the persecuted church. Elizabeth is also an adjunct research fellow at the Arthur Jeffrey Centre for the Study of Islam at the Melbourne School of Theology. And you can get detailed insights into persecution of Christians around the world on Elizabeth's website, elizabethkendal.com. Elizabeth, we've been laying a bit of a foundation, but I know that listeners will be very interested in how the effects happen, really even on our doorstep. And I wonder if we can spend a few minutes talking about some of those issues, because it seems to be that if the Middle East is some sort of an example that might prefigure our own fate in the decades to come if we ignore those Christian foundations, is that even a possibility? Are we overstepping the bounds of what is possible or likely if we discuss that possibility?
Yeah, on the blurb of my book, I make that exact point. I've said, if the Christians are to survive as a people in their historic homeland, so in Mesopotamia, then the Christians of Mesopotamia will need all the help they can get. And if Western civilization is to survive as a force in its historic heartland, and I'm specifically meaning Europe, then we had better start seeing, hearing, and believing the Christians of the Middle East, for their plight prefigures our own. It's not so much a likelihood in Australia, because we're blessed by this great, what they used to call the tyranny of distance. It's sort of like the blessing of distance, really. Most Muslims who migrate to Australia are actually fleeing persecution, or they are highly skilled. They're coming to study, they're coming to work. It's much more difficult and a much more different situation in Europe, where actually Turkey is controlling this, what is essentially a mass migration of young Muslim men into Europe. literally, and if Europe sort of irritates Turkey, and they won't do it because they know what will happen. If Europe irritates Turkey, Turkey has told them they will open the floodgates even more. And there have been, I think Germany has taken 1.3 young Muslim men. So these are Muslim 20-year-olds without their girlfriends, wives, families. They then apply to have family members brought. They haven't got women, and I don't know if you actually saw in London. Actually, they've had a massive influx recently of young Albanian Muslim men, and there's so many of them that the government are putting them up in all the beautiful hotels across London. And recently they came out to celebrate Albanian Independence Day, and they completely paralysed the city of London. There were so many of them. So in Europe, the situation, I believe, is existential. It really, really is.
Let's get a focus onto our own shores in Australia and how those sorts of lessons might be gleaned from what's happening in the rest of the world. I'll just rattle through. There's four things I can think of, and there might be some others, but there's real emotion today, Elizabeth. And I'll just rattle through these four. But Umar Patek in Indonesia, he's one of the Bali bombers. He built the bomb that killed 202 people, including 88 Australians. That is a really raw point right now today here in Australia. I mentioned in the introduction ISIS brides being brought back from Syria into Australia. Then I mentioned too that in an earlier conversation this morning, we were talking about the Victorian Premier, Dan Andrews, who is reportedly elevating and promoting Islam now, all the while doing all he can to cancel Christianity. And the other issue, of course, that some listeners will be aware of is new criminal code laws in Indonesia that are banning sex outside of marriage, and that only applies not only to Indonesians but also to foreign visitors. So there's all sorts of effects on what is happening religiously by way of laws. Not sure where we want to start on this, but why don't we start with perhaps Umar Patek in Indonesia? That's the most current issue that a lot of people will be very emotional about today. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think the first and the last one there, that both relate to Indonesia, and they really go together, and that is the fact that there has been a real rise of Islamic conservatism, Islamic fundamentalism amongst the masses in Indonesia. Now, I wrote quite extensively on this during the last Indonesian elections. In order to get himself re-elected, President Jokowi, brought in this fundamentalist Muslim cleric as his vice president. And he really, to me, and I wrote on it at the time, that just indicated the degree to which even Joko Widodo is having to play a bit of a religion card and say, look, I'm really favourable to Islam, vote for me, even though the people know that he's a fairly secular sort of Muslim. And yet he stayed silent while Ahok, the Christian governor of Jakarta, was jailed for blasphemy. He has just stayed out of it all. And there's been a lot of pressure for quite a long time on the issue of the Bali bombers. So this is very much, I think, I don't know the degree to which Patek has been rehabilitated or de-radicalised or anything, but the fact of the matter is, when you've killed, more than 80 people, to get a shortened sentence to that degree is really incredibly offensive to so many people.
Okay.
It sort of lines up with the whole criminal code thing. There's a real push even at the grassroots level that makes Joko Widodo need to prove himself to be playing an Islamic card. And I don't think he's as powerful as maybe we think the president is. The parliament pushes these things through.
He's playing a political game too, and I remember those conversations that we had about appointing a 2IC who would be very favourable to Islam, and the thoughts that there will be changes in Indonesia that will come. And I think this is over a number of years, and so you start to see these things come to light, and you say, well, yes, there's the fruit of actually appointing that 2IC who was going to be, a general, a well-respected but Islamist, and these things beginning to change. Some people might be thinking, is Dan Andrews doing something similar, just sidling up to Islamists, being their friend, offering to fund, a huge amount of money for an Islamophobia campaign to stamp out racism against Muslims in Victoria, promising all sorts of things before the election and now delivering to a minority group which actually does, obviously, vote for Dan, the Labor Party in Victoria. Is this a risky thing for a premier in any state to sidle up so closely to an Islamic community?
It's absolutely bewildering. I just find it bewildering. So you've got one of the most openly pro-LGBTQ premiers like we've ever had, or probably Australia's ever had, trying to get friendly with the Muslim community. The Muslim, Dan Andrews, I'm sure, was aware of the controversy about Qatar. I mean, no one was interested in whether Qatar was going to had religious freedom. For the hosting of the Soccer World Cup, no one was talking about, we can't have the World Cup there. They don't have religious freedom, and you can't, Qataris can't become Christians. They were very, very worried about, what about all the LGBT? What about the fact there's no same-sex marriage? What about there's no trans? And, it's just it's bewildering to me. So here is Daniel Andrews, who goes out and marches in the very front of Victoria's Pride marches every year, going into a mosque that I'm sure would preach death, not just death to apostates, and death for blasphemy, but death to LGBTQ persons. I mean, how they can even stand in the same room together is bewildering to me. I think that both parties are trying to see what they can get out of each other. And I wouldn't be surprised if both parties secretly despise each other. It's all a lot of political play. And I really, to be honest, I wonder how many Muslims would vote for Victorian Labor simply because it's so overtly pro LGBTQ, and I think
it's an interesting dimension, isn't it?
Yeah.
This also plays federally, doesn't it? How the ISIS brides, some obviously there's different motivations, no doubt, that people can point to, but putting the welcome mat out to ISIS brides coming back from being supporters of a war against Australians who fought there as well, this has rubbed people up the wrong way. How do you look at that from a Christian viewpoint, Elizabeth?
Yeah, this is a really difficult topic. So, there are going to be some, in this group, there are people who are sort of innocent of how they came to be in that situation. I think you've got girls who are genuinely radicalized, who really believed that they were going to be great, champions for Allah and bring about a caliphate, and they believe all this stuff and they're going to bring it all back with them. Then you've got all those children, and I think, boy, it's just awful. I'd hate to be making these decisions. These children who had no say in where they were born. And one of the cases, of course, was this young boy. I think he was taken from Sydney. His family, his father, I think an uncle was an ISIS recruiter. The family went over to Syria. His father fought with ISIS. His brother became an ISIS recruiter inside Syria. They lived in the caliphate. He was 14 when they were taken over. And the photos of him as a 14-year-old, he's just like any other Aussie kid on a bicycle on a near Sydney beach. And here he ends up stuck there and stuck in a prison. And then when ISIS tries to break its prisoners out, he ends up dead. And it's tragic, there's no doubt, but it's the parents bear the ultimate responsibility for all this. So it's really, really complicated. The people I feel sorry for politicians who have to make these decisions, but the people I feel really sorry for are the people who have fled ISIS, the people who have fled Islamic persecution, who's the Assyrians, for example. So a lot of these ISIS families are going. I think they're going into Western Sydney, and where there are large Assyrian communities, and the Assyrians, who, I tell you what, if you meet Assyria, if you can have access to the Assyrian community, do so. They're probably some of the most beautiful, gentle, gracious Christian people I have ever met in my life. They are terrified. They are horrified that the very people who have sold their people into slavery, who drove them out of their homes, ethnically cleansed them out of the Nineveh plains, sold their children into slavery, that they're being brought back into the country. They are afraid. They feel betrayed. They are deeply confused about all this, and I think I feel most sorry, for the Assyrian community in Australia that has to live with this decision.
Without the history and without an appreciation of those religious foundations, you can't really understand the fear that might be experienced in Western Sydney. Interesting, too, to note that, when you've got favour to refugees who come from this Islamic base, and even favour to those who've got the association with ISIS, over some that, and this controversy has been playing out for the last decade or so, even over whether those who identify as Christian from those refugee communities would be given any level of priority to come into Australia. That's one of those debates that somehow or other you've got to engage in when that opportunity comes.
Yeah, absolutely. I can remember how difficult it was in around 2016 for political figures in Australia that wanted to prioritise Christians in the Middle East, in the middle of all this ISIS terror, and they realised that the Christians were the most vulnerable communities. They really had nowhere to go. They couldn't even go into the United Nations camps because it was too dangerous there for them. They would face all the discrimination and persecution inside the camps as they were facing outside the camps. So they basically fled to churches and monasteries in the area, and as they were struck by ISIS, then they just had to flee to the next one. And they're such a vulnerable minority. They're disarmed. They are small in number, and they just don't seem to have the allies that other groups have in Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Iran. So they were incredibly vulnerable and facing elimination, and quite a few politicians really tried to help. And as soon as they said we're going to I can remember actually Tony Abbott used the term. He was aware of how difficult this was going to be, so he deliberately didn't use the term Christian, and he said the persecuted religious minorities. And it took about 24 hours for the penny to drop, with those who then screamed, "Oh, that means Christians. We can't have that. That's the religious discrimination." But I can actually tell you that there were a couple of one Catholic and one Protestant MPs, quite senior MPs, one Liberal and one Labor, who went over to the Middle East and they actually sought out Christians themselves. They went to the monasteries, they found them, and they organised helping them to come to Australia, recognising the depth of their plight. But on a popular level and in the media, you just couldn't say it. Couldn't say it.
We are taking calls 1800 316 316. Let's hear from Abraham in Fairfield in Sydney. Hi, Abraham. Welcome.
Hi, Neil. How are you?
Very well. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, Neil and Elizabeth, I'm a proud Assyrian myself. Sorry.
Yeah.
Mm.
The things we're saying here obviously strike a chord with you, Abraham.
Very much so. Put it this way. All the things that Elizabeth have said is true. It's 100% true. I just want to add one story which affected our family there, is that my ancestors, which were my grandparents, had a large farm in Mosul itself. And we've got to be so grateful living in this wonderful country of Australia. Like they say that we have freedom of speech. We can say our thoughts. But over there, you cannot say anything against anyone, especially in the Saddam region. Like, for example, what actually happened is somebody asked my uncle, he was a taxi driver, and he asked, well, what do you think of Saddam? And you've got to be careful what you say. And unfortunately, my uncle said the wrong thing. Next day, he got a knock on the door, and they just assassinated him straight away in front of his family. So you can understand how it touches the chord with myself and family and what so. But, it's hard, it's difficult. And what Elizabeth said about being humble and stuff like that, when you do speak with an Assyrian family or sit down with them, that's all you get. You get sorrow for them. You look in their eyes and you can feel their frustration in their hearts, just like I am now speaking.
Abraham, let's get a thought or two here. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts for Abraham?
Oh yes, and you see the sadness. You see the sadness. It's not even. It's beyond the fear of Islamists, fear of what's happening. It's the sadness that thousands of years of Assyrian heritage in their homeland, where they are the indigenous people, it's all just at risk now. But I keep clinging, and I'm sure you do too, Abraham. I'm sure you do, about that beautiful verse, the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 19, where there's a prophecy concerning Egypt, Assyria, and Israel. And God says, blessed be Egypt. He says, the Lord Almighty will bless them, saying, blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. That's Isaiah 19, verse 25. And, in the day when this was written by Isaiah, Israel was this little vulnerable country in the middle of these two superpowers. Assyria, the strong superpower, and Egypt, the rising power. Today, when we look at it, we have a Muslim country, Egypt, a Christian people, Assyria, and a Jewish country, Israel. And the promise still holds. And what I really love about the promise to Assyria there is that it's the work of my hands. Politicians are not going to achieve this. Politicians will not give the Assyrians their homeland. They're hopeless, the politicians. And we do not put our trust in princes. It's hopeless. God will do it. God has promised it. And Assyria will be the work of his hands. And this is what the church must pray for. The promise is there. We do not sit back and expect governments or the United Nations, or heaven forbid, to do it. Assyria will be the work of God's hands. He will do it, and we must pray for it. And until it happens, we must help the Assyrians survive.
Abraham in Fairfield in Sydney, thank you so much for making your contribution to our conversation today. Time has run out. The encouragement, of course, is for listeners to these sorts of issues that we're raising today to be prayerful about them. And when it comes to things that are happening on the other side of the world, sometimes we're less inclined or more general in our prayers. But you can certainly get some more insight, some more detail and some more depth when you visit Elizabeth's website, elizabethkendal.com. You can sign up there for the Religious Liberty Prayer Bulletin. And but when we're playing with fire, when we're dealing with all sorts of religious turmoil, and the flashpoints that can so easily overtake different nations. These sorts of things demand for us to be prayerful about what's happening there, and as we've drawn attention to what's happening here. Elizabeth Kendal is a religious liberty analyst and advocate for the persecuted church. Her website, elizabethkendal.com. And Elizabeth, I know that you're also reaching out to a younger generation too. You've got some bite-sized bits on Instagram. Any other ways that people can connect with you?
Yeah, the Instagram's a new thing, so that's Religious Liberty Prayer on Instagram. And the Religious Liberty Prayer Bulletin is something I feel so deeply and strongly about. I just long to see churches praying for the persecuted every week, just as like a natural part of everybody's prayer life. Not a special thing that you do once a year or anything, but all the time. It should be part of our prayer life to be praying for the persecuted and upholding our persecuted brothers and sisters on the front line of the spiritual battle.
And just before I let you go, just to quickly mention those books. You made a reference to your books through our conversation. One of those, the most recent one, After Saturday Comes Sunday, Understanding the Christian Crisis in the Middle East. And the earlier one called Turn Back the Battle, Isaiah Speaks to Christians Today, and you'll be able to get a hold of those books. And I'll point you to that website once again, elizabethkendal.com. Elizabeth, thank you so much for sharing your heart with us once again today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil.